environment, but also salutogenic natural environment. And as you have seen in the announcement, I think we have two perfect speakers for these areas, because on the one hand, they have very nicely complementary backgrounds. On the one hand, Golembiewski, who holds a PhD in architecture and neurosciences. And on the other hand, Eike von Lindern, who comes more from the psychology side with a PhD in social and environmental psychology. Besides these distinctions of the two, they also share a lot of commonalities, I would say, because both have a very strong record in publishing and doing research around their fields, always also with a link to salutogenesis. And on the other hand, they are very much involved in practice, really making a difference with architecture, for example, particularly in the healthcare setting, or with Eike also consulting different agencies of how to create more restorative environments. And I think this dual perspective also will be visible this morning when we talk or listen to the talks and discuss what we hear with these two great speakers. And with that, I'm now going to lead over to the program itself. After my intro, which will be over in a second, we will jump into the first presentation of Jan. Then we will have time for questions and first discussions with Jan. Then certainly it's also important to take a restorative break, which is always important. And then on the second time, then Eike will be speaking. Eike, just come in here, because a very special thing is that Eike even took the effort to come to my office, so we can be in the same room, because you know how important environments are, Eike, for good social interaction. Yes. So it's really great that you did that.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Yeah. Okay. So we will switch a little bit here in front of the same screen. Yeah, and so Eike will be then second. Also some questions targeted at him, and in the end, we will bring them together, the two speakers and what they have said, and have some overarching discussion. With that, I'm already at the end of my introduction, and I'm happy now to hand over to Eike. Just need to take the Jan. Sorry, Jan is first, because Eike is next to me now. Yeah, thanks for correcting me. I will. Oh yeah, actually now, Jan, it's your floor. Actually, in that
Hello,
case.
yeah. So it is my floor. Welcome everybody. Without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. So this is probably the last you'll see of me for a few minutes. It's evening here in Australia. I'm not sure how many countries represented in the group that have actually shown up to this meeting, but it's now just after 8 p.m. So if my mood is a little bit different from your morning energy mood, well, you know, that's why. Okay, I'm going to get straight onto it and share my screen. Now, I hope you can hear me. I'm just going to get rid of all this so I can see what I'm talking about. All right, salutogenic architecture. Now, I'm an architect, although I've been an academic for a long time, and I run a company called Psychological Design, which is based here in Sydney. And we specialize in designing buildings that have very particular bespoke psychological and behavioral outcomes, and or at least desirable ones. And one of the tools that I have always come back to again and again is salutogenesis, and that is why I'm interested in it. So without further ado, here we go. Why isn't this working? There we go. Okay. I'm just got to find my spot in my notes too. Here we go. So since people started building, people have always been interested in designing our architecture to represent people better and to be a better fit for humans. They wanted to promote well-being and the whatever enhanced, they want to enhance the human capability through their architecture. And this dates right back to ancient times. For this practice, they relied on superstition and religiosity and instinct and art practice and trial and error, and you name it, it's gone into architecture over the last few millennia. But since the 1980s, this effort has genuinely exploded with a whole lot of new insights from political humanism, such as, feminism and post-colonialism, etc., and the hard sciences, especially neuroscience and chemistry, biology, and the behavioral sciences, such as psychology and sociology, anthropology, and marketing. The capacity of architecture to shape human desires, behaviors, thoughts, emotions, and mental well-being can now be predicted better than ever before. It's even being used, as the Canadian-born superstar architect Ty Farrow tells us, to create health. So that raises the question of how can architecture actually create health? Now, from the generic conceptualizations of both white coat medicine and architecture, that task seems insurmountable, possibly impossible. But ever since the 1970s, architects have been playing with paradigms about health to enable this effort. They've had mostly very singular kinds of interventions, but that was what was appropriate as they were really trying to create acceptable scientific evidence. And so they needed very controlled environments and very singular experiments. Most of the work that they did doesn't actually involve architecture, but what's outside of it. That is, views into the natural environment and the closely related attention restoration theory. But I guess you're going to get more about that a little later from Eike. Now, assuming that architects do want to go beyond the views of nature as much as we would like to stay there because it's quite wonderful, or that they can't provide views of nature simply because they're not in control entirely of their projects, like their given sites, for example, which might be grey or brown field sites in the middle of cities. There's still plenty that an architect can do. They can use salutogenics, for example, and I found that this really helps because, of course, salutogenesis is a theory of how environmental factors affect health. But before we go into that, let's just cover off some basics. I know you all know this stuff, but life is difficult. An average person uses 7.5 megajoules megajoules per day just doing nothing. That is the equivalent of 250 iPhone chargers. And then they'll also use approximately 4 megajoules per hour of doing rigorous exercise. And they can also use a megajoule or so for very consuming mental work. Now, that energy is converted from the food we eat, but we can't deny the effort it takes to turn those joules into actions, thoughts, and emotions. And the question really is, why do we bother? Antonovsky's salutogenic theory suggests that if we fail to bother, or if we're unable to adapt to stresses, whether pathogenic, social, or other kinds, a person becomes depleted and then illness ensues. In extreme cases, death follows shortly thereafter. In other words, In the salutogenic paradigm, one doesn't contract an illness so much as give into it, when demands along the path of life surpass a person's ability to cope. The forces that we have to deal with are ubiquitous: physical, mental, and emotional challenges of every stripe. We have to deal with loads of difficulties, but the challenges we face don't stop there. Even life challenges that bring us great joy can still be taxing, physically and emotionally draining. Now, I spoke about joules of energy and the food that is required to create it. And I'm sure that a talented scientist could translate all actions, emotions, and thoughts into their calorific quanta. But Antonovsky, the founder of salutogenics, didn't really see most human problems in terms of calories. He did understand, however, that the resources that we need are finite and are sometimes quite specific to ourselves and our circumstances. In this side, he agrees with the generic conceptualizations of white coat medicine. But his interests and the concept of salutogenics looked at health far more broadly, as if resources were just like joules of energy, in that they are indeed readily translatable for any given needs. The general divisions that he conceptualized are three areas of need known as the generalized resistance resources: manageability resources that make our corporeal and physical needs more manageable; meaningfulness resources, which draw our emotions toward a greater sense of meaningfulness; and resources to support comprehensibility and make the world around us more understandable and navigate cognitively. Together, the generalized resistance resources strengthen a person's overall sense of coherence, SOC, and draw it toward an improved health and well-being and away from the brink of collapse. Importantly, the deficits, called generalized resistance deficits, can create health in any number of ways. There may be subtle differences, but in theory, a person may become vulnerable to the same malady regardless of whether they're unable to cope mentally, emotionally, or materially. Traditionally, health design is about providing for the specific needs of clinicians and carers, while they tend to acute illnesses and injuries. But this isn't about creating health. Indeed, Indeed, hospitals appear to be designed only to make people sicker. The key to salutogenic architecture is in using the language of architecture to support those generalized resistance resources. Architecture that enhances manageability supports the basic biological needs of users, improving safety, convenience, and comfort. Having control over life and its events creates a rewarding experience, whereas the feeling that you're totally out of control is disempowering and sometimes terrifying. At a minimum, the needs for physical health must be met. In general terms, this means air quality, access to natural daylight, thermal, acoustic, and visual comfort, and beyond this, maintaining a sense of privacy and security, convenience, and of course the architect's staple: function. The Baylor School of Business in Texas, USA, which is shown here, designed by Overland Partners, is filled with natural light throughout the year and at the same time prevents thermal heat gain, glare, and other issues by using meticulously designed skylight modules in the 4-story atrium as shown. Comprehensibility in architecture means helping people make sense of and negotiate the physical environment. Comprehensible architecture is empowering because it nurtures our sense of individuality and identity. Readability and connectedness mean that the built environment will make sense to users, empower them with understanding, and reinforce people's projected identities and self-representations. People are guided by distant landmarks and distinctive features within a space. So windows that provide visual connections to the weather, time of day, and landmarks such as identifiable buildings, architectural concepts or artworks and other prominent features support holistic orientation. Logical design also helps, especially in institutional scale buildings, but also in our own houses. Like, how much easier is it to know where a bathroom is if you just can tell by the layout of the building rather than having to ask? The designers of medical architecture, the architects of the Ferndean Children and Young People's Inpatient Service, tell a story through illustrative artwork on the walls that reinforces identification for each zone. There are clear windows so you can see where you are in regard to the rest of the building, and the flow between the building is very, very clear also. The animals and colors that are in the illustrations are a key part of a carefully crafted navigation system to help children and teenagers find themselves both in the building and in a narrative context. Authenticity also helps people to be authentic themselves, and it's far easier to deal with life if you don't have to keep up unreal facades. Authenticity is encouraged with the use of natural and comprehensible authentic materials wherever possible, and by allowing people to customize their spaces as they please. Comprehensibility is closely associated with perception itself, and perception isn't a passive process. We don't sense objects in the environment and subsequently decide how we're going to engage with them. We commence the cognitive part of acting on an opportunity for action as they're provided. That is, when we see an opportunity to do something that's interesting to us, we just jump straight in and we really think about the details afterwards. This and if the actions that we see are inappropriate, well, then we choose subsequently after the call, so to speak, not to do it. This is through a process of inhibition. This process is a fundamental step in creating memory, which is also another pivotal aspect of comprehensibility. To engage people cognitively, we have to do things and we have to interact with the environment. Now, a rich sense of meaningfulness gives us the impetus to overcome extraordinary demands. With a strong sense of meaningfulness, our problems can be recast as worthy challenges that deserve our engagement and commitment, even to death, even when our most basic needs just can't be met. With meaningfulness, one can encounter dreadful circumstances, pain, illness, insufficiency of resources, etc., and feel confident that in the long run, everything is going to turn out for the best. Meaningfulness is a force that leads to recovery and a satisfying, hopeful, and fruitful life. And designing for meaningfulness is therefore the most important thing that a designer can do to improve the salutogenic value of a building or precinct. But designing for meaningfulness is difficult because of what supports meaningfulness. That meaningfulness differs greatly from one person to the next. Meaningfulness is ultimately about the investment a person makes in life outside of themselves, in their family and friends, their loves and their passions, their work and their commitments, and in what they will live and die for. Meaningfulness can be found in religious practice, doing voluntary work, to close emotional ties with beloved ones, pets, gardening, and caring for others, in contributing to a group, ideology, or society, in making a difference, and therefore making your personal mark on the planet and making sure that it's a worthy one. Now, what's really interesting here is that the more abstract that person's mission is, the more they find meaning in it. But it also, the more mercurial meaning can be. So being abstract and mercurial, they can disappear in a second if they're not properly structured, comprehensively, and in the face of meaninglessness. Now, meaninglessness is a quality that we find ubiquitously in institutional design. Locked doors that should be open, aggressive and polarizing symbols and signs, harsh lighting, nasty odors and visual and acoustic noise, or even filth. There are forgotten spaces, sidewalks that run and stop before multi-lane highways, barbed wire fences, CCTV cameras. In fact, all design where users of the space are regarded as secondary or even troublesome next to the primary functions of that space. Once meaningless has been removed, however, meaningfulness can be enhanced using a couple of very basic tools, the first of which is quality. The provision of quality surroundings tells people that they are valued and that they're in a positive environment. The second, and no less important, is the provision of positive choices of things to do and get engaged with. You might remember that choices support comprehensibility, but the affective dimension, that is the emotional dimension, in that regard, positive choices do far more than choice alone. They make us feel good because positive choice is an outcome of an evolutionary high point. Almost throughout our evolutionary history, we've had to struggle to do what needs to be done. That is, to protect our families and flocks and to bring in the grain and pay our bills. But when the grain is siloed, there's suddenly nothing pressing to do, and it's time to celebrate and acknowledge our prosperity. Other people are a mainstay for meaningfulness for nearly everybody. So we can use socio-pedal design to support social interactions by designing great places for parties, visitors, intimate conversations, and other gatherings. Animals are also important. So we can design special provisions for animals. People find meaning in metaphysical abstractions, so we can find provisions for religious and spiritual activities. People find meaning in self-expression, so we design support for art, music, poetry, etc. And finally, people find meaning in peace and solace in nature, and that means integration with the natural environment. This image here is of a mental health facility that I led the design on in Qatar. I don't believe it's been built, but it had animals in it. You can see the horses in the background. It had a large amount of parkland within it. And the entire design it's designed to bring people together instead of having mess halls or institutional dining rooms. It's got 3 restaurants, and people emerge from their places of residence and they essentially live on communal streets. So following, I've just got some ideas that are meant to foster meaningful connections to the external world through the design environment. No, I won't. I've lost that slide. Never mind. So, although the physical environment isn't generally recognized for its influence on the intensity and quality of social behavior, it does have an undeniable impact. Now, I want you to consider how you feel when you're in a foyer of a grand hotel or palace versus, let's say, a sketchy side street in an LA slum. One encourages people to be their best selves, and the other makes people jump at shadows. The difference between the two is essentially aesthetic. It's because of its aesthetic value that art becomes important for meaningfulness. Art always gives us a choice. You have to choose whether you're going to like it or not. But either way, it's a positive choice because the consequences of disliking a piece of art relative to another are actually very minimal. When designing, it's important to think beyond the primary target user and consider their visitors and friends also. So think about adding children's playgrounds, communal activities, and opportunities to see and hear other people. As an example, my own project, the Gallipoli Home in Sydney, has a hammam. Now, the unit is a residential home for Turkish residents with dementia and other serious problems as they age. But this hammam is conceived to not just help bathe the elderly Turkish people, but also to provide a culturally appropriate and exciting affordance for their families and friends when they come to visit. So you might not particularly like seeing Dad, but you know, having a hammam makes it worthwhile, and the kids will like that. Was that a bell saying that I'm about to finish? No? Okay. Somebody's mic is on. That's okay. The integration of nature and the built environment is another significant source of meaningful experience for users. Eike is sure to tell us more about that in a moment, but from my perspective, its importance is because that nature offers very special choices, very special positive choices. It inspires play, relaxation, social interaction, and personal expression. And very importantly, it allows the mind to wander to enable the restoration of attention. Nature also offers the opportunity to engage in a positive aesthetic. And as we say, they're very important for managing meaningfulness. This combines both positivity and that level of abstraction where people find most meaning. These images are from the Farmhouse project, which is by Prechter Architects, and it shows how a new generation of architects have invited nature into the built environment. Now, what I've presented today is just a little insight into how salutogenics can be applied in architecture. It can be used everywhere, from schools to airports, inside our homes, our hospitals, parliaments, and prisons. And so here we are in Sydney, and if you're ever in town, make sure you look me up. I hope my earphones, my speaker was on.
But mice, not now it's on. Thanks a lot, Jan. I think this was a very impressive, comprehensive representation, what the three dimensions of the sense of coherence are about, the comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. And I think you illustrated this rather abstract concept in a very specific way, how it would apply really to build environments, the architecture. That was already cognitively, I think, a very appealing talk. And when you illustrated that also really more on this emotional level to sense how much difference it makes in which type of environment you actually act and how it really will trigger different behaviors and also feelings, emotions. So thanks a lot. This was really a very thoughtful and also emotionally activating insight. Thanks for sharing that experience linked to the salutogenic model. With that,
a great pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. With that, now we do have time, certainly, for discussion. So please, if you have any question towards Jan, any comment, whatever you would like to share, please just speak up, and then you will be visible on top of the different participants. And I don't assume everyone speaks at the same time. Anyway, it always takes a warming up. And if you are too shy to speak up, just write your comments or questions in the chat, please.
Good morning. Can you listen? I'm from Brazil, and here it's 6 a.m.
Oh my goodness.
Congratulations, Jan, for your presentation. It is excellent. It's wonderful. I developed some research here in environmental psychology here in Brazil, and we here in I'm from South Brazil, and we have the nature that is very beautiful. Nature, the green place here are very beautiful, but at the same time we have the problem of violence, urban violence. And I enjoyed a lot your presentation because you do the link with salutogenesis, yes, and the sense of coherence. And this is my doubt, because I try to do these links between environmental psychology and salutogenesis. So it's very interesting when you exposed about the dimensions of sense of coherence. And I'm thinking about how can we implement in schools this design, and how can we do this link with salutogenesis, thinking about the environment of school where children need this kind of experience for their development. So do you have any study about this linking with salutogenesis?
It's something that I do in practice. So I've designed a few schools. The schools that I've designed tend to be for specialist populations, such as schools for people with autism, or specialist in that, you know, the last school that I designed is a Montessori school. In fact, I'm just going to grab it, just because I've got it here. So this here is a Montessori school. One of the buildings. It's kind of cute, and it's open plan, but the Montessori is a good place to go to answer this question, because Maria Montessori worked with street kids, and she found that the street kids that she had were really rowdy, and they weren't well suited for education. They were a bit wild, and so she developed a paradigm of education that really worked to engage street kids, and that paradigm is very closely associated, accidentally of course, with salutogenics. And the first thing that she offered all the children were lots of choices of activities of what to do. So children would make their own choices about what they felt like getting engaged with, and the teachers would give them stimulus, like various sets of toys or various sets of learning tools. And the kids would get into whatever they found interesting. Another rule was don't interrupt kids once they're in a flow. If kids find them, you know, that they're really enjoying their maths and they've finished a page of maths, give them some sticky tape and some more paper so that they can just continue the page. So you support them, and if they end up doing that same maths problem for a year, that's fine. You don't take it away from them. You let them fall into their fascination. And so to some degree, it helps to change the paradigm of learning as well. But the environment should offer a lot of choices. It should be positive. It should be passionately positive, and high quality spaces, because high quality spaces tell people that they're valued.
Very good. I didn't thought about this. We have one school here in my city with this method, and it's very interesting. And I'm going to look for some research, some investigation. If you have, I'd like to read about. Thank you very much.
I'll have to think about what I have.
Okay, but it's good. So webinars are also for connecting. Just drop Jan an email, and certainly you can deepen that. Jan, we do have a question also in the chat. Claudia, please raise your question yourself if you don't mind. Claudia Meyer, yeah. Your mic is still off.
Yeah.
It's okay. I'll read the question.
Okay. It's an easy question to put, difficult to answer. But first, thank you for your very impressive and concise and very dense presentation. I enjoyed it very much. My question is, architecture is something privileged people can afford. An architect who makes a nice building, and you had the example of the slum and the palace. And my question is, how can we use salutogenic or create salutogenic architecture, salutogenic environment to strengthen health equity, and not to sort of, yeah, the rich can afford an architect and good architecture and good environments. And what about the ones who have less resources?
That's a very good question, and it really points to where most of my career has taken place. Most of my career has been in institutional architecture, because until recently, I've very rarely ever had the privilege of having individual clients come to me and say, I want this built for me. But institutions will come to me because they have a problem. They, like, for example, an aged care facility in Western Sydney has come to me because they can't afford. They've run out of money and they can't afford to give the quality of care that they need to give to their clients. They're a charity and they just can't afford it. The costs have become so high. And so they've come to me and said, what, can we get the building to do some of that work? And I say, yeah, of course. And so we've designed a paradigm where the staff are actually removed from the living environment. The living environment, the model is a hand. And the living environment is here and here and here and here around a courtyard, or several courtyards. And these fingers come from the outside. So there's essentially a wall of building around it so that people don't look out onto the streets and get tempted by everything that goes on, but they look inwards into a common courtyard. So that's very much part of the paradigm. But these fingers that come from the outside are where the staff are. The staff are omnipresent. They're as close as they would be if they were in these buildings with the residents, except they're absent. They only step in when they're required. The reason for this is that people in aged care get bored and they start looking at their carers as opportunities for interaction and social variation. And the staff can't give that quality of attention to their clients because they've got things to do. They're employed to do other things. They have to change the sheets, they have to cook the dinner, they have to change somebody's underwear, they have to check somebody's blood pressure. They've got a lot to do. And so by removing the staff, it means that the living environment becomes much more natural and far less institutional. Each one of these becomes an individual house. What stops them from being an individual house is if there's a staff member in the middle of it, because individual houses don't have those things. But these suddenly become individual houses around a common courtyard, which is based on a European centre-ville, a plaza. So it's the paradigm, again, like the education, the paradigm has to shift in order to maximize the salutogenic possibilities. But one of those things is about choice. And by taking the staff from being constantly in the eyes of those clients, we're making the place cheaper to run. We're saving a lot of money for that organization. And a salutogenic building, a salutogenic landscape will save money because health has become a critical expense.
Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Jan. I think this was a very thoughtful also example how to rebuild this kind of spaces where people really are in custody in a way that they really still feel that with choice, and also based on that the meaningfulness, as you repeatedly emphasized rightly. Yeah, thanks a lot. Any other questions? We still have quite some more minutes to ask Jan for additional thoughts.
Namaste, greetings from India.
Hello.
Pleasure to be with all of you and listen to this wonderful presentation. I was immediately thinking of the concept optimal healing environment, which is a beautiful concept in modern hospitals. How does your work tie into this optimal healing environment, where also they want to experience wholesomeness, a spiritual connection, etc. So I just thought, is there a parallel between the work you are doing in Sydney and the concept of optimal healing environment in healthcare?
Well, absolutely there is. Are you in Pondicherry? I was in Pondicherry until 3 days ago.
Oh my God.
I've just spent the last month in Oroville, which is just half an hour on my cycle from Pondicherry. So it's a place I know quite well. And actually, I have given several lectures on salutogenics in Pondicherry or in Oroville. So it's just sad that you missed it.
Keep us on your itinerary the next time.
I go there a lot. So the question was about optimal health environments, and there's definitely an optimal health environment. And the optimal health environment isn't only about the physical environment or even the natural environment. The optimal health environment has to be a lot more than that. It has to be a social environment as well. It also has to be optimized in other ways in order to further reduce the stress on the people who are in that space, like the climate, for example, in July or I think August, Pondicherry becomes inhospitable to just about anybody but a Tamil. And there's very little you can do about it except blast people with air conditioning, but that keeps them inside. So that's a suboptimal solution. So in order to optimize the solutions, we look first at increasing the meaningfulness of the space. We look very, very carefully at it and we brainstorm, how do we create meaningfulness for those particular people in that space? And there are a number of ways we can do it, and nothing is out of bounds. And spirituality, religiosity is celebrated in salutogenic circles because it creates meaning. But we also look at the design of spaces. Often when people want to design a salutogenic space, they go, oh, let's do curvies, because curvies are soft and curves are, make me feel good when I look down on my plans. But guess what? You get down on the ground amid all of these curvy buildings and you can't find your way. And it can be very frustrating, particularly if you're cognitively impaired. So we have to also make comprehensibility a feature. Logical design that is appropriate for the space. And finally, manageability. We've got to make sure that basic functions of life are sustainable. I know that during Pongal, the Tamil Christmas, the noise in your state is so extraordinary, and people don't have glass in their windows because they need the air to flow through, otherwise it becomes too hot. So there has to be some kind of solution that cuts the noise whilst still allowing some breeze. So they're the kinds of things that we'll be looking at.
This is just so beautiful, because when we think of architecture, we often forget the human beings who are in the architecture. And thank you for pointing out that it's the people who are there, the interpersonal relationships that happen in that space, that are part of the salutogenic architecture. I think it's such a beautiful way to have a humanistic angle to buildings.
For me, the human is so central that it would never occur to me to design a building without reference to the humans that use it. I'm not one of those kinds of architects.
May I ask also along this line a short question, because when we will have a break soon, Jan, you several times said now how important the user is and how he feels, what the needs are of this person, and also you said we brainstorm. So can you tell us a little bit about, certainly you use a participatory approach, I assume, in doing your work?
So involvement of the people who the building is about is absolutely critical, but it can't be, it's not easy always, because the end users are rarely aware of the capacity of architecture to make any difference. And they will often tell you what they like and what they don't like. I'm not interested in what people like and what people don't like. I'm interested in what people will engage with and what people won't engage with, and what people will find joyful and what people can find meaningful. I'm not interested in what they like and don't like. So I have to engage with them on a whole different level. And one of the things that I do is, it's good that I'm in my office.
Yeah, very good.
I have literally thousands of photographs, which I show the clients, and the photographs are of the units where they are, and the photographs are of other units, and the photographs are of flowers and pizzas, and there's really no logic at all in what these photographs are. And I get the users to fill out post-it notes and just make totally random comments about those flowers and things. And I then go and take that data, I go through all those comments, and I take them very seriously, and I use that as a way of understanding how the clients are thinking, what they're responding to in far more abstract terms. I'm not asking them whether they want a door to turn left or right. I'm not asking them whether they want pink walls or light blue walls. I'm asking them what they're responding to. And I'm noting what they're responding to. And in a group of people, you'll find those responses are echoed and are repeated among different groups. And so that's how I conduct those client workshops. Then I take the data, I analyze the data, and then I use that data and I reflect that back. And I say, from what I hear, you know, this particular group, they're Croatians, and they're incredibly good. They might have dementia, they might not be able to recognize their daughters, but they're incredibly good at identifying an environment, even interior environment that's from Croatia. They'll say, that one's from Croatia. How do they know? It's not like the color of yellow on the walls is any different. It's very, very subtle cues that they can read from the environment, even though they've got dementia. And so I use that information and go, this is important. You know, they're noticing, even though they've got advanced stages of dementia, that they really want the interiors to really have this kind of Croatian look because they respond well to it. So that's how I manage that kind of consumer engagement.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot, Jan. Sorry to interrupt, but we want to take a short break now, and we will be back after that break and have a common discussion afterwards. But thanks again for also sharing this insight how to actually apply participation, because often it's so easily said, but how do you do it to get really meaningful expressions of the needs of the people? I think that's a very nice.
I recommend people look up the Center for Inclusive Design.
Great. Okay. If you chat in the chat, that's perfect. So we take an 8-minute break now, I suggest, and we will be back at 11 o'clock sharp at our time here. You know your time, so it's like an 8-minute break. And then we will hand over to Eike, who I think will show a very nicely complementary approach, not only because he's more focusing on the environment, but also because he does it more, I would say, from a research point of view also, which I think really complements perfectly what we heard up to now. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
See you in 8 minutes.
Come back. I hope most participants are also back here to listen to the second presentation. I now hand immediately over to Jan, who will share his presentation on restorative and salutogenic environments.
Actually, to Eike.
I'm so bad with names. I'm so sorry, Eike.
Yeah, it just becomes a running gag, I think.
It's a little bit entertainment in between, absolutely.
Yeah, or to test awareness, you know who is presenting. Yeah, just have to share the screen again, I think. So that should hopefully work. No, that's the wrong.
Need probably good it again.
Yeah.
That was mine first.
Yeah. Can I close it completely? Yeah. Okay. So I can start this one first and then to share. Perhaps it works now. So can you see my presentation so far? Okay, at least 2 thumbs up. That's good. Yeah, actually, I'm really happy that Jan presented his work and his doing before I present my work. I also just discussed with Georg a lot that there are so many interconnections between our approaches and so many links we like to discuss. We just had the idea it would also have been nice to make a joint presentation where Jan and I are more or less changing roles all in one presentation, because it would add up really nice, I think. Well, I hope you will share this idea, and it's not only our impression. So what am I talking about today? I'd like to talk about restorative environments research. So it's not a genuine salutogenic approach. I'm a psychologist, environmental psychologist by training, and did my PhD in this domain, but came into contact with salutogenesis quite often, and I think there are a lot of connections between restorative environments research, environmental psychology in general, and salutogenesis. So I assume you all know a lot about salutogenesis, so I won't go too much into detail on theories in salutogenesis, but like to present the perspective of environmental psychology and restorative environments research. I'm not sure if many of you have heard about environmental psychology. Sometimes it's a quite exotic discipline within psychology. So health psychology, clinical psychology, counseling psychology is quite more popular and frankly known by people. But we are also a whole bunch of nice people in environmental psychology. Besides looking at the connection between human health, well-being, and natural and built environments, it's also a strong track record in promoting sustainable behavior. But it's connected to some degree, but it's a different story. Actually, environmental psychology and looking at the environment, what it does to us, how we interact with the environment, is not a new idea. So we have a lot of literature and history going back to it. Where it maybe all started from a psychological point of view is in the beginning of the 20th century is Willy Helpach. Willy Helpach was a student of Wilhelm Wundt, and Wilhelm Wundt is the founder of the first psychological laboratory in Germany who did scientific psychological research. So this guy, Willy Helpach, made some observations that, for example, the formation of clouds, and if you're in the mountains, that it has a fascinating and almost hypnotic effect on humans, that there are features in the environment that draw their attention to them by themselves. So, and these processes in the environment, natural processes, actually influence mood and human character. That was one of the hypotheses of Willy Helpach. And thus he became interested, among other topics, in how climate, weather, landscapes, and the environment are related to human health and well-being, to the human soul. During that time, he used the terms geopsyche, geopsych. I don't know if there's a proper translation in English to it. So yeah, just to give you this background fact. And still, this old research by Willy Helpach informs and inspires psychological research in the human environment domain until today. So, and yeah, not only because of that, we can say that environmental psychology actually has a very strong track of research on natural and built environments. We already heard in Jan's presentation that perceiving nature, interacting with nature has benefits for health and well-being. And Jan also mentioned two prominent theories in this field, and also anticipated that I will go into more detail on that. And Jan, you were right, I will go into more detail on that. Yeah, but first, some more facts about human health and the environment. So yeah, from research, from studies, from own experiences, we can say that especially natural environments and forests can be associated with increased health and well-being, and also with the stress reduction function. I put natural in quotation marks here because it is not really too clear defined what actually is a natural environment or what is more or less natural. It may depend on the perception and on what you are used to, actually. Nevertheless, we have in society regular media outlets that promote going outside, going to nature, taking a break from everything in nature. Sometimes the impression is created that you only have to go to nature and everything will become fine and it will heal you from everything. So there's a lot of emphasis put on this, especially in just everyday media. And also during the COVID-19 pandemic, we experienced that going to nature and going hiking was actually booming. People really liked it as a coping strategy from being isolated, cannot do any longer what they used to do, breaking up with habits, forming new habits. So there is some empirical evidence that people really like going to nature as a coping strategy to deal with stress and with changes, which might also impair their sense of coherence, perhaps. There's a strong development in the therapeutical domain. So there's a growing number of clinical facilities, therapies that try to include nature into therapeutical programs, into curing or dealing with depressions, but also in the domain of dementia, which also Jan related already to. So there is studies that show that in healthcare facilities, if there are a lot of natural elements, if they include favorite places in nature and the therapy, that it is actually a good setting for doing therapy. So it helps to get the desired therapy outcomes. There's also big trend going on, at least in Europe, in the domain of forest bathing or Shinrin-yoku, which is more or less spending time in the forest, perceiving the forest. It's also a lot to do with sustainability and slowing down your own life, putting focus to other senses than just the visual sense, to just perceive what's going on there. So mindfulness plays a big role in that. And nature is used to promote mindfulness or to do mindfulness training also. And of course, we have this big domain of architecture and design in healthcare facilities, medical practices, but also in everyday buildings. Jan also talked about socio-petal designs, which are designs that promote social interaction. Of course, we have also social fugal designs, which can be understood as designs that should prevent social interaction to create perhaps sometimes more privacy, or you see it in public buildings like train stations. Sometimes the benches are arranged in a way that they actually hinder communication and social exchange. So it's also a design of the environment to actually impact behavior or behavioral options. So we have a lot of things how we can change the environment, which will be related to social aspects of life, to behavior, and to health and well-being. And of course, we have this big research domain of parks and green spaces, how nature is perceived, how people use parks, what are good parks, and so on. From literature and research, we can at least say that we have some physiological effects on health and well-being and also psychological effects. I just brought some examples here. So there's empirical evidence that blood pressure and heart rate decreases in so-called restorative environments when spending time in nature, leisure time mostly. We find a lower concentration of stress hormones, improvement in sleep quality. Also, we have an activation of immune functions, may also be related to functions of psychoneuroimmunology. So there are clear links between that. On the other hand, we have, additionally, we have psychological effects like feelings of increased well-being and relaxation and decrease of depressive symptoms, that nature is experienced a therapy supportive setting. People report restorative calmness, and natural environments usually promote physical activity and increased connectedness to nature, which can be used for environmental education and building up sustainable behavior. So there's a lot of potential in natural environments. In this domain, we have more or less two big theories that are still used today. They are both from the 1970s, 1980s. It's a psychophysiological stress recovery theory by Roger Ulrich and the attention restoration theory by Kaplan and Kaplan. I will go briefly through it. We could have a whole webinar on this, I think, or a whole series of webinars, but just to give you an idea about the theories. The psychophysiological stress recovery theory was first formulated by Roger Ulrich, who observed that patients in a hospital had different rates of recovery after a surgery. So he searched for notes in the nurses' books about how patients fare after a surgery, and noticed that those patients that had a view to nature from their room recovered better, had less complications compared to those patients that had no view to a natural environment. And from that, he developed the theory that just perceiving nature initiates processes of healing and recovery. So Ulrich said that specific visual characteristics may evoke stress, while others may evoke recovery from stress. The theory says that this effect is innate and grounded in human evolution. This is a part which actually has to be discussed because we cannot prove it, actually. There might be other functions, but I'm coming back to that later. So characteristics in the environment that actually promote recovery from stress is if the environment is perceived as moderate interesting, relatively calm, with mild aspects like mild colors. So it has to be perceived as mild from the feeling. The visual stimuli have to have a focus point. The visual focus point has to be of medium depth and complexity. This really links up to what Jan said, that the environment has to be readable. I have to understand where I am. I have to get the opportunity to create a mental map of the environment that helps me to act and to behave in a functional way, in a way that corresponds to my current needs. So if an environment is designed in that way, it will be more easy for me to create a mental map and to behave as I like to behave, or what I want to do there. The theory has informed architecture and building of interiors, also in city planning. For example, it says, or brought some examples here with the photographs. One is in a residential area where there are usually only gray concrete housing blocks. And some designers here painted a tree on it, because the studies on psychophysiological stress recovery say that if you perceive nature, it will actually calm you down and relax you. And the theory gains entry into, for example, healthcare facilities, dental healthcare. So there are experiments and empirical evidence. If people view natural landscapes during a dental surgery, that they perceive far more less pain and stress from the surgery compared to patients that have a neutral environment or have no natural environment. And perhaps some of you also have noticed that, especially in dental care facilities, sometimes there are a lot of natural elements. There are sometimes monitors with nature documentaries showing up. They have glass panels in the roof that you can look at the sky while you're there. So, and we have really good data that shows that this reduces anxiety in patients and reduces also pain. So the next theory I'd like to present you, the second one is the so-called attention restoration theory. Jan also referred to it shortly. It has more or same something in common with the psychophysiological stress recovery theory, but also some distinct elements. Basically, it also says that spending time in nature will help us recover our depleted resources. So basic assumption of that theory is that we have limited cognitive resources for so-called directed attention. And we need directed attention in everyday life. If we have to focus on tasks, have to get information from a more or less information overflow in everyday life, just to filter out what is relevant for us. We have to filter irrelevant information, distinguish between what is useful for us and not. There's a lot of impressions going on, a lot of noise, smells, visual impacts, and this will eventually diminish our resources for concentration and for directed attention. So after a while, we will experience so-called mental fatigue. This is that we don't have the resources anymore to focus on things. It becomes harder and harder to filter out irrelevant stimuli. I think all of you have experienced this, even after a quite interesting webinar. After 2 hours, I think most of you will be really tired, especially if there's a lot of information coming on. Someone is perhaps on the telephone and in the same office, and you have to concentrate on what I'm saying now. A lot of written things on the slides. So this will actually contribute to your mental fatigue. Associated with mental fatigue is impaired task performance, impaired health and well-being, and also an increased stress level. And this is something like a downward spiral, with impaired task performance, increased stress, it becomes harder and harder to focus and concentrate. And it will even contribute more to our mental fatigue and will provoke more stress with all negative implications. So this happens on a daily basis, and this depletion of cognitive resources is the reason why we actually need recovery and restoration. And attention restoration theory says now that there are some environments which can be framed as restorative if they feature coherence, compatibility, fascination, and psychological distance to a medium or high degree. Because perceiving these aspects will initiate psychological processes that restore depleted resources that we otherwise need for directed attention. These are some very basic assumptions of attention restoration theory, which now brings us into the features of the environment. So there are those four aspects: coherence, compatibility, fascination, and psychological distance. They all have to do with the perception of the landscape, of the environment. So, for example, coherence is element in the environment that help us in sense making, so that there are forms and characteristics that we understand without having to think about them. It has a lot to do with so-called fractals. So small shapes that are repeated, they are more easy to read, to comprehend for our mind, for our cognitive system, and they will ease to orient ourselves in an environment. So, for example, here in this landscape, I exactly know where I can go, where I can do what, where I should not go, perhaps. And this also applies to built environments, of course. The aspect of compatibility more or less means the person-environment fit. So what kind of elements I find in an environment that actually meet my expectations and my needs? So does the environment support what I want to do or what I have to do in an environment? If this is the case, it's fine. I perceive it as compatible. If there's a lot of discrepancy, I find the environment as not suited for my current mood and my current needs, and then it would not contribute to my health and well-being. So I might also experience this as chaotic, for example. Compatibility has not to be perfect, because depending on what I want to do, it can be nice to have some challenges because they feed into self-efficacy experiences. But it has to be a good doses of everything, depending on what I want to do. Experiencing fascination actually means that the environment has features which draw attention on them without me having to direct attention. It can be a small river, it can be a flower, some insects, some things going on, but also the formation of clouds in the mountain. So, and this function of drawing attention to it by themselves helps me to relax the resources I usually need for directing my attention. And then finally, we have this feeling, the sense of psychological distance, which are elements in the environment that draw me into a complete different world, that help me to daydream, that activate my imagination and fantasy, which give me a distance to everyday life and everyday demands and concerns. So, and if environments feature the perception of those characteristics, they are very likely to initiate restorative processes. So far for the theory, it has been tested mostly on natural environments, but recently there are also studies on built environments and cities where we also find if you perceive things as fascinating, also cities and built environments can contribute to health and well-being. So it does not only have to be nature. The theories are quite old. They are both from the 1980s, and there is only very little theoretical development going on. That's only since the last 5 to 10 years, people revisit the theoretical assumptions and build up on the theories and integrate new findings in them. So there is actually development in the field, but it's unfortunately quite slow. Another problem is that replication studies and meta-analysis sometimes don't find very strong results. So in distinct studies, we find those effects, but overall, they are sometimes quite weak to medium. And it's a big question mark behind it, why this is the case. I come up with an idea a few minutes later. Yeah, this point I said before. So some constructs are poorly defined, some measurements are not so good. Another point is that most research that has been done focuses on visual aspects of the environment, or other senses like haptics, like smellscapes, like soundscapes are largely omitted in this kind of research. It's also often the case that people are not there in the environment to rate it, but that they are shown photographs. And then sometimes it's not clear if looking at a photograph is actually the same as being in that environment. So there are some methodological issues in this domain of research. And of course, a lot of researchers put the focus on whether and to what degree people experience coherence, extent, compatibility, fascination, and psychological distance, but rarely look into the why of that. So the context and individual variances are largely omitted until recently. Yeah, and so most studies find that more natural environments usually provide more complete recovery. The effect is likely more a function of perception, physical activity, perceived so-called setting interdependencies, and other factors. So I've brought you some of the factors here I'd like to present to you. I said before, we'll dive a little bit into psychological theory here. So the setting interdependencies, this grounds on a theory by Roger Barker on the behavior setting theory, which basically says that we as humans go from a behavior setting to behavior setting over the course of a day. There are different behavior settings. If I wake up in the morning, have breakfast with my family, for example, it's a different setting than commuting to work or being in the office. There are different people, there are different roles associated with it, different behavioral patterns are appropriate or not appropriate. And of course, also the environment is completely different. And this all works together, which influences my perception, my behavior, my well-being, my perceived fit to the environment. And this is basically what behavior setting theory says. And it also says that different settings should be distinguished because they have to fit the needs, what I want to do in a certain role, in a certain environment. Good example is home office. If I'm working from home, but don't have a distinguished working room, it's perhaps the living room, it will interfere with other family members eating there, with children playing, for example, there. So it won't promote or support what I want to do there, but it becomes mixed up with different life functions. And this is actually not very good from a psychological point of view. Yeah, and we can define settings by diverse aspects. I don't go into detail here, but I hope you get the meaning more or less. The problem is if I use just one setting for almost every task I want to do, it is too much for us. So we have done too many tabs open, so to speak, and it won't contribute to our health and well-being, but does the opposite. So much for the theory. We had an empirical study on this in the Swiss population, where we asked for the relation of the Swiss population to forests and how they use forests during their leisure time. And well, we found out that people in Switzerland really love forests and contribute from leisure time forest visits in their, in terms of health and well-being. But we had also some forest professionals in that sample. And then we looked into the data and thought, well, what about those forest professionals? How do they perceive the forest as natural or health promoting environment? And we actually found that they have an impaired experience of restoration. when they are in the forest in their leisure time, because they are reminded of work. So these are the settings that come together. Spending time in nature in the forest is not only a leisure time setting for them, but also is intertwined with their work setting, which prevents them from having the full recovery compared to people who have no occupational engagement with forests. So we found this in different studies actually, and came up with an own theory behind it, which we can apply to different environments. For example, if I want to have an environment I use for restoration after my mental resources have become depleted, I will do good if I have large contrasts to typical settings where my mental resources become depleted. If I can have a contrast between these settings, my restoration function will maximize, my constraining function, my mental fatigue will minimize. But the more these settings come together, both concentration task and restoration task will become constrained. Or if I have a working setting where I want to really focus on things I have to do, I shouldn't have too many things that draw their attention on them and withdraw me from things I have to focus on. This will also impair the function of the environment for what I want to do, for my needs. So this is how we brought in behavior setting theory into attention restoration theory and combine it for health promoting environments. And we've tested that in a large sample in German speaking countries, and where we actually found in the structural equation model that the stronger people perceive setting interdependencies, that they carry one thing from a demanding setting over into their leisure time setting. It might be a mobile phone that they have with them in their leisure time and check work-related emails, for example, that remind them of stress and work tasks. This really impairs their sense of being away, their psychological distance, and it also impairs, mediated through the diminished sense of being away, the outcomes related to self-perceived health. There was 9 or 10 different scales behind this latent construct here. So we found a mediating effect, but also a direct negative effect on outcomes related to health. It really brings empirical evidence to distinguishing more settings from each other. So keeping a clean leisure time setting and a clean work setting, for example. Yeah, we have a lot of publications on that, and also in the book chapter in the Handbook of Salutogenesis, we go into more detail there. So you can read it all there. It's an open access book. Georg introduced it already to you, but if you don't have it, just download it and read the chapters. It's quite good. Another point which is often omitted is what role plays physical activity in restoration and in the environment. How is it connected? If we say that nature does good to us, well, it's not with one snap of a finger that we are nature, and usually we don't just sit there, but we do something there. And how is it connected to feelings of restoration and to health promotion? We also did a study on this, where we asked the Swiss population, it was also a population-wide survey, with an open-ended question, how active they are during leisure time on a just normal work day. So, and almost half of the population is rather passive. It was qualitative answers, we categorized them. People are watching TV, just spending time in the living room, playing games, talking, eating, sleeping, things like that. And 1/3 was very active. It's people doing sports, going to the gym, for example, doing yoga. This is the active part. And then we also asked them, what kind of environment do you use for the leisure time activity? It was also an open-ended question where people had to describe the environment. And then we rated it how natural it is. We see that 50% use a quite low natural environment, maybe their own living room with only a few plants in them, with a nice view to nature, but also approximately 30 or 22% used outer environments on a regular basis, and 18% partly in and outer environments for the leisure time activity. When we brought both the data, activity, and environments together and found that they are strongly correlated, people who are active usually also use outdoor environments for their leisure time activity, for their recreational activity. And there we see the high interconnection of using natural environments with physical activity. So we don't have to, so we cannot neglect the amount of physical activity if we look into how people recreate in nature. We have to take it into account. And we actually did it. It was also a nice model. I don't go into detail here. It's a lot of details, but we measured the perceived setting interdependencies, the level of activity, and the degree of naturalness of the environment used for leisure time, and related is to perception of being away through environmental factors, perception of fascination through environmental factors, perceptions of being away through the activity in itself, and fascination through the activity in itself. And we see some nice mediating effects on self-reported restoration coming from the level of activity. The more people are active, the more fascination and being away they perceive, and this translates into more perceived restoration. The stronger the setting interdependencies were, the lower were those fascination and being away perceptions, and the more natural the environment was, the stronger was the being away and fascination perception, but only for the environment, not for the activity. And we also found direct impacts on self-reported restoration. So far, so good. A big advantage of those structural equation models is that everything is taken into account at the same time, and we find, or we can calculate effects relative to each other. And it came out that the level of activity explains much more variance in the self-perceived restoration than the naturalness of the environment does. So and this was really shows that we cannot neglect those levels of activity when we talk about nature or using natural environments or built environments as health promoting environments. We also have to look what people are doing and what people are thinking actually, how many setting interdependencies they perceive. So it's a combination of the cognitive functions of the mind, of behavior, of how activated they are, and the environment. If these three play together in a good way, so it's a natural environment, people are quite active, and they experience contrast to demanding settings, the health function maximizes. We can show this in the research, and this has implications for environmental design, for buildings, for public space, for housing, for leisure time activities, and so on. Another factor that is often neglected is weather or climate. And we had another nice study where it was not planned to have weather as a variable in it. It was a field study we conducted in the Black Forest National Park in Germany. We spent a whole week with students there, and our task was to evaluate some hiking paths, how they contribute to health and well-being. And the study was 5 days, consecutive days, in the summer, and the Black Forest National Park is about 1,000 meters, so there can be weather changes also in the summer. And we had, from a scientific point of view, the luck that the first 2 days were almost 0 degrees Celsius, so about freezing. We had snow, it was raining, it was really awful weather. And the rest of the week was really sunny with 18, 20 degrees Celsius. People went there with t-shirts and short trousers. It was really lovely hiking days. It was really unfortunate for our study participants because they had to sustain all these things. But then in the data analysis, we could distinguish between the perception of the same environment in good and in bad weather conditions, just to break it down. So, and we had 3 different paths. One was a very plain path, so with a lot of forest roads and open landscape. And if we look into the perception, the ratings of the path in bad and good weather conditions, here's the perceived restorativeness on the y-axis. It is from 1 very low restorative environment until 9 a very strong restorative effects. Here we have different waypoints, so people had to rate at different points on the trail, and we see that in red the cold, fog, and rainy weather it is below this blue line, which means sunny and warm weather. So in bad weather conditions, the restorative experience of this hiking trail differed. Where the trail became more natural, more wild, the functions got nearer and nearer. So here the weather effect didn't play such a big role as it did in the less natural environments. On another trail, which was quite natural and also had some wilderness aspects in them, but also built aspects, we find an even stronger reaction to the perceived restoration. So in the beginning, where there were slopes going uphill, it was in cold, bad weather things, it was like a threat to the health of the participants. In good conditions, it was quite nice. Then when it became really wild, these are aspects of wilderness here, the functions are more or less the same. And when going out of this trail, it is becomes more and more urban, we see that the cold and bad weather conditions are associated with less perceived restorations compared to the sunny and warm weather conditions. And we had another trail, which was a wilderness and nature trail, where we almost found no differences depending on the weather. So there you can see that the health function does not only come from the environment, but also changes with what people are doing there, how the weather is. So there's a bunch of things influencing if an environment is actually a restorative environment or not. And if we know that, we can translate it into health interventions that will make recommendations for people. For example, if there's a period of bad weather, it might be good for people to go to more wild and natural areas. If the weather is really, really good, it can also be just in more or less built environments, which contribute then to health and well-being. Just to give you an expression or impression of that kind of research. So some not really conclusions, but thoughts on restorative environments research and salutogenesis to close up now. So take-home message for example, could be a theory in restorative environments research really needs further development. Major theories come from the 1980s, and new developments are only slowly integrated, if at all. And we just saw in this research result that the context, the setting interdependencies, also multisensory perceptions, activities, social aspects, weather, climate, etc., play a significant role for recovering of exhausted resources. Restorative environments provide empirically well-documented positive effects for health and well-being. They can be framed as resources that help combating stressors on a daily basis. The insights about daily exhaustion and restoration of resources can, from my understanding, augment the understanding of key concepts in salutogenesis. For example, how does this daily basis contribute to the sense of coherence? And of course, vice versa. From environmental psychology, we can learn a lot from salutogenesis. And I think that, yeah, we would all profit from more exchange between those fields of theory and practice. Yeah, and last but not least, the results from restorative environment research in combination with findings from physical activity and behavior setting research and so on can widely be implemented in daily life and contribute to general health promotion, like the design of parks and green spaces, the design of residential contexts, work contexts, spatial planning, architecture. So this series really link up with things that Jan said and presented before, I think. So I would make the concluding remark that restorative environments can actually be something like a general resistance resource for health and well-being. Yeah, that should be it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we have some minutes left for discussion or questions.
Yeah. So let me get back in and change places, I think. Yeah. So thanks a lot, Eike, Greenbelt I learned, so right name. It was really a fascinating talk because, as we all know, within the salutogenic model of health, we certainly have a very clear understanding what the sense of coherence is about. But then general resistance resources are such a broad list and on different levels that we would need to take consideration. And I think you've showed really in a fascinating way, even with the last example, how this resource, how I behave is interacting with my natural environment, and that again is the level even of the weather. So I think that was fascinating, and also across settings, that we cannot only look at experiences in one setting, but how this also interrelates to experiences in others was fascinating. And the last fascinating point for me was that really you also made it very clear resources are not as something given. This is something you use, and it's depleted, and so you need to take care of restoring it again, which also I think is quite fascinating, because we often consider it more as an independent variable, and it's just fair, but it's not just fair. You need to do something. So thanks a lot. That was really quite exciting. Yeah, so now it's your time. Please ask any questions.
I think it was.
Do you hear me? No.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I saw that Marguerite also raises her hand, and I just bump in. So, thank you, Eike, for a really nice and lovely talk. Very interesting, a lot of aspects which I also recognize in work and research we do. What I a little bit miss, and that also relates to an earlier question which also Claudia raised in the previous presentation, is that that makes a big difference if you look at the broader societal aspects, like if we have good jobs, if things are taken care for, if we live in a situation of peace. I think these things all count. But I think on broader societal level, also, if I'm in a bad job, yes, I need to recover in nature. But if I have a good job, which energizes me, which has all the aspects, then it's a bit different. So how do you relate this to the broader societal issues or the societal determinants of health, this work you're doing?
Yeah, it's an excellent point you raise, and it's a criticism we often hear, that only for people who are open for nature, have the resources, can actually use nature and have the concept of going to nature and hiking and enjoying things there. And for people who just have to work to care for their family members, for ill people they know, they don't have the resources, or sometimes don't have the time to go to nature, right? There we come in with the theory of those setting interdependencies, but also people who have not the resources to go to nature could perhaps find a strategy of recovery and relaxation by looking into what actually stresses them the most, and what setting is to their disposal that has the weak as possible interdependencies to the stressful setting. And I think you can then have guidelines for those people, or for social facilities, which can then elaborate with those people where they actually find relief. It might be going to a cafe, going to the cinema, going to a concert, spending time with friends, doing yoga. So these things can also be very restorative, although they don't have to take place in nature. So it depends on what resources I have to my disposal, what behavioral options I have, and then make the best of it in terms of enlarging the contrast between things that usually tax my cognitive resources. So it's a very abstract message, but I hope it answers your question. So
no, I agree, but I think in principle our work needs to be as such. We shouldn't be in situations that we get depleted. So our work should be salutogenic in itself as well, I would say. But yeah. Thanks for your answer.
And of course, there are no recipes that work for everyone. So that's what I often criticize with media outlets, which just say we have to go to nature, we have to integrate more nature into our life. That may work for some people, but there's also a share of people who has no connection to nature, or where it might even be dangerous to go to nature. If I have some allergies, for example, it might not be the best idea to go in the forest during springtime. So, and I have to find other strategies then but for that, I have to know what stresses me actually. So the stress and relaxation strategy have to be connected to each other. So it's like person-environment fit, a stress relaxation fit I have to find for myself. And I think we can elaborate people or guide people in becoming more aware of what actually stresses them and where to find relief from their stress, and help them then to turn it into their behavior and daily routine that they can implement these insights. Yeah.
The nice thing about working in institutional spaces is you know what stresses people, because they're always the same spaces. There'll be X space, Y space, and Z space in any institution that causes stress. There's a mental health facility in Sydney where 11 people were killed over a period of many years. And a friend of mine who was a psychologist who was working there started mapping where these deaths occurred, and they found that they all occurred in exactly the same spot. So he started calling that the corridor of death. And once he called it corridor of death, people started recognizing it as such. And of course, with it, you know, very soon they demolished it and rebuilt that place. And so far there has been no violence in that spot. So if you can identify the behavior settings, to use a word that you were using earlier, where stress is demonstrated, you're halfway there. And just removing that is a good step.
You're absolutely right. And we actually do it with behavior mapping strategy, so that we build maps on behavioral patterns, emotions that are associated, but also combine signs we find in the environment. So if we see graffiti somewhere, we look at what meaning is there. If we find something's demolished, it will be integrated in the maps. So this also gives information about behavior, how people interact with the environment, where they find what. This can be integrated in the redesign of environments. But you look for the reasons, why is that happening there? What can you learn from behavioral patterns there?
Great, thanks also, Jan, for jumping in. Margaret, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I came in a bit late, but it was really interesting. And I thought that your critical points at the end were also so interesting, you know, about the literature and the fact that this isn't really being updated. And I mean, one sort of new area for literature development is things like nature-based solutions and environmental services. And I wondered if your literature links at all with that literature, you know, on nature-based solutions and so on. Is there any link between them?
Yeah, there's a link between it. It's perhaps a little bit complicated. With this nature-based solutions, you mean things in the domain of sustainability promotion, for example, to have more sustainable way of living, of development in society.
And urban, it is also sort of for urban, you know, positive spaces in urban areas. I think nature-based solutions also used for that.
Yeah. There's a strong link in it because one line of arguments in this restorative environments research, maybe that, I have to go a little bit back for that, sorry. So they have the assumption in common that we as humans developed in natural landscapes and savanna-like landscapes, that we have learned that some environments help us in surviving, that nature is good, it is relaxation associated with it. And this is often the line of arguments why natural elements are good for us and help us to relax, help us to recover from stress. But this line of arguments actually neglected that evolution is still going on. So people came together in cities, in villages, because they found relief from a threatening nature there, from fierce animals, from rainstorms and so on. So it increased their chance to survive. So there were a lot of positive and restorative aspects associated with building cities having defense in cities, having health services in cities. I don't have to hunt my own food. I can go to the supermarket and so on. So, but with this building of cities and communities, also the stress entered these kind of settings, because the main focus of our living, or most of our living, is now centered in the city. We work there, we have a lot of information there, we have a lot of pollution and noise there. So this negative aspect of cities and built environment and non-natural solutions may be also learned from our behavior, how we are used to live in cities and what we perceive there, that everything is focused and concentrated there. And we only experience fascination and relaxation in nature because we actually can go there in most parts or some parts in the world without fear or danger. If I will go hiking and had the fear of bears, of bandits or whatsoever, it wouldn't be relaxing anymore. So the whole surrounding, or the whole culture and civilization has to promote this idea of nature and health. So one thing to linking it to natural designs, there may be the risk of, if we put too much nature into cities, that also the health benefiting effects of nature might be too much mingled with the stress focus of the city, and that we also learn to adapt it and don't perceive it as fascinating anymore, because it becomes just so usual and does not make a contrast. But it's only a thought now. I don't have empirical evidence for it, just an idea coming up now. I don't know if
I've also considered this issue. And I delivered a paper which was quite controversial several years ago, talking about how small amounts of so-called nature within the city actually can have an inverse effect, because it makes the city that much bigger. So instead of getting on your bicycle to go to work, you suddenly have to get in a vehicle to get to work. And so it causes urban sprawl, because suddenly between each house, instead of there being the next house immediately or the next building immediately, suddenly there's a quarter of an acre of forest, which is not a forest, and yet it's not a park, it's not anything, and it just causes urban sprawl. And so I was talking about that as being potentially deleterious for health.
Mm.
So the combination, we have to get it right. We actually have to design our nature. It has to be purposeful.
Mm. Exactly. It has to be purposeful. It has to be meaningful. It has to meet the needs of people, of users. We had this discussion point also before, that just putting something there because it works or it is nice won't work. It has to be connected to the people that actually use it. And sometimes people also have to learn how to use it, and the design, the environment also has to learn and has to adapt to what people need. So it's a really interconnection between both things. And I think the same is with these nature-based solutions. They are certainly fine reducing our carbon footprint, for example, saving energy, but still people have to adapt it to their lifestyle. It has to fit, it has to have the same functionality or even a better functionality than the common things we already have for people to take it up. So here in Switzerland, a former office building where I was working in, it was a complete automatic net zero building. Everything was fine from an environmental point of view. But it was regulated by automation. So if sunshine comes in, the blinds were going down. And of course, people didn't like it working in the office, and they started blocking and sabotaging those mechanisms that the building could not react as it should be. And yeah, the whole meaning of the building got up in smoke, so to speak, because it was not connected to the need and the function that people really needed.
Okay, and looking at the time, I think we need to get to a closure now, if you don't mind, because I think it's fair when we say we close at 12 o'clock to do so people can go to the next things they would like to do, also maybe some good restoration. But I think actually this last discussion also showed that there are always with two levels, which always has been certainly important in health promotion. There is this need for shaping our environment so that they are really health promoting in an equitable way, also what Lenneke repeated several times rightly, that we really need to make it really work for as many people as possible in a participatory way, as also certainly Jan repeatedly made the point. So we need to involve people on this collective level, and at the same time, I think in this highly complex living environments where we live with different settings, where we also move from one setting to the other, we also need to empower people to make the best choices. Jan also was emphasizing which choices people need to have at these different settings, but that will certainly requires that people are taking purposeful choices, what really is best meeting their needs, as we, for example, study very much around the concept of crafting, how you can proactively shape your different living environments. I hope that you also got as inspired as I got during this inspiring lectures, and particularly also the discussions where you all joined in. Thanks a lot also for sharing your ideas here. And I just would like to mention, somebody it's here, we do have more webinars coming up. I won't share the screen now. I will just ask you to go to our website, STAR's website, where you will see there are 5 more webinars coming up. I'm just reading the titles here. One is about salutogenesis in permaculture. The next one is about salutogenesis and planetary health. Then there's one around digital learning, one about applying salutogenesis in residential care settings. So there's also some overlap what we heard today. And last but not least, salutogenesis in education and PhD supervision. So in all very important settings, as we heard today. And I'm also looking forward to these next events. And thanks again for all of you taking your time in this engaging discussion, and particularly to our two very interesting speakers. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.